This week we will be tackling the concept of functions in PHP. For those of you who have taken the JavaScript class, you are probably familiar with these and they work much the same. Functions are going to wrap this up because what it's going to do is it's going to allow us to kind of bring everything together that we've learned to date about operators and conditionals and make them repeatable or easier to use in the sense that functions are statements that can be used, or statements or expressions that can be used over and over again in a program. That's the idea. And for example, if you've ever worked with a WordPress site, even if you've just worked on the front end and have added some content, WordPress uses functions all over the place, and most of the time those functions, they're actually contained on a separate page called functions.php and are included in much the same way that we have included headers and footers when you took ICT475. So the great thing is these functions make it easier to code certain elements that we are going to use over and over again. The neat thing about functions by comparison to the PHP that you've been writing so far is up till now the PHP, as the server kind of reads through it, it starts to actually execute and parse that code. But the difference is with functions is it just kind of sits there and wait, and it doesn't execute until it's actually called. And we're going to look at how we both create a function as well as how we call functions. So as I said, there's two parts to every function. There's creating the function. That is where we actually name the function and we put the code as far as what needs to be executed within it. And then calling the function is when we place that particular function name, and we'll see how this is put together in a moment, we put that in the code where we actually want the code to execute. So it doesn't need to exist right next to the actual function code itself. Like I had mentioned in the previous slide, it can even exist on a completely separate page. So how we create a function. Here's the basic syntax that we use. It starts with the word function, and then we give it a name. And much like variables in PHP, the function name can be anything we want it to be, but it has to start with a letter or an underscore. And I recommend, for the sake of simplicity, always start it with a letter because oftentimes underscores are saved for particular other like global functions. In this case, it's called function name. We've called it this. After that, we have an opening and closing parenthesis. And we're going to learn about what we can use those parentheses for shortly. Then there's an opening curly bracket. Then there's the code that's going to be executed in the function. And this can be a very long piece of code if you so choose, using conditionals and operators, loops. All of this stuff can be contained within a function. And then when we are finished, then there's the closing curly brackets. So here we were creating the function and we were giving it, its parameters in the code, and then there's calling the function. And to simply call a function, we don't use the word function anymore. We just use its name and the parentheses, and if there are any parameters in those parentheses, those would go in there, and the semicolon. So when you're actually going through the PHP, you're just going to see this function name because the actual code that it's taking care of might exist someplace else. So for example, this is a very simple piece. I recommend that you open up a blank file, save it as a .php, and actually place this code in it to see just how this works. So we're going to create the function itself. And this one we're just going to call message. And all this function is going to do is it's going to echo or display the words, this is my first PHP function. Then later on that page, and it can be contained later in some HTML, and then you can open up your PHP. I mean, this is all contained in one. Then we simply just call the function, which is just message, the parentheses, and the semicolon. So I keep using this word parameters. And what does parameters mean? Parameters kind of work like variables. Now I know many of you were feeling challenged with the concept of that define function that we used in the Order Summary Revisited lab from class 7. What that was is define is actually a PHP, it's like a PHP defined function. There are some that already exist within PHP. Define happens to be one of them, and then within that were 2 parameters. The first one was book 1 or book 2, whatever the case may be, separated by a comma, and then there was a dollar value. So really that was a function, and you were using it without even knowing it. But what functions allow us to do is they're kind of like variables, and they allow us to pass information in for the code to execute. So let's look at some examples. So in this case, we have a function. We're creating a function. It's called family name. And then we have the parentheses. And now this time, by comparison to when we created that very first function, where it was just the opening and closing parentheses and nothing was in between it, this time we're putting a variable called first name. And what that does is it's going to pass it into the code that's executed. And the code that's being executed in this case is just simply echo, calling that variable first name Isaacson. So this is my family first names. So then later, after that closes, so we have function family name, we're passing the variable first name, then we have the opening curly brackets, the code we're executing, and then the closing curly brackets. And then right after that, we're actually calling the function a number of times, and we are saying to use, in the first case, use my first name, Chris, as that variable first name, because it is contained within those parentheses. So it's telling the code to use this. So in the first case where we're calling this function, it would say Chris Isaacson. The second time, then the word Trent is going to fill in for that variable first name. So the second time it's going to say Trent Isaacson, then Spencer Isaacson, and Trixie Isaacson. So that's how we pass a single parameter. Here's another example of how we can do this. In this case, we're going to pass 2 parameters, and then we're actually using an operator within our function. And so what we do when we call this function is we're going to add 2 numbers together and then say the sum of these 2 numbers is. Okay, so let's take a look and dissect this a bit. So we're creating our function. It's called add numbers. We are going to be passing 2 variables. And in this case, it's num1 and num2. Inside of this function, we are creating a new variable, and it's just called sum. Sum is num1 plus num2. Now notice, the nice thing about using variables here, about what's being passed into the function, is that the numbers that are included can be anything, but it's still always going to add number 1 to number 2. And then when it's done, it's going to echo the sum of these 2 numbers, of the 2 numbers is, and then it's going to show the sum. After we close this particular function, we call that function, so it's just add numbers, and there are the 2 numbers that we are using. So 10 is going to become the variable num1. 20, and notice they're separated by a comma in both cases, and you can actually pass several. It's not limited to 2. So the 20 is going to become num2. So in this case, it's going to be sum equals 10 plus 20, and therefore it's going to echo sum of the 2 numbers is 30. And finally, in example 3, I've just simply added yet another variable that's going to be passed through. This one, all it's doing is echoing what it is. And so we have first name, age, and species, and then it just echoes out a sentence based on that. Within this function, we have the 3 variables that it's going to pass. So Chris becomes first name, 46 becomes age, and human becomes species. So that sentence that the function, when it's called up, would say, Chris Isaacson is 46 years old and is a human. So I recommend in example 1, 2, and 3, that you go through and actually create these, plug in your own information, change up the variables if you want, but work on passing those variables into the function so you understand how that works. This is really as in-depth as we're going to go because this is not a PHP class. There's a lot of other things that we could be covering when it comes to functions, especially there are some very specific commands that can work with functions, and some of those are going to be addressed in the book. So I do suggest that you look through that. And speaking of which, then the exercise is actually going to be out of chapter 3, which you were supposed to be reading this week anyway. And then there's going to be a lab for this week, which is going to be continuing to work with that order summary form. This time, though, we're going to be working with the actual order form itself, which was HTML. We're going to be converting it over to PHP. Those will be the couple of things, and you're going to be getting lots of practice with functions. The lab, you're also going to be getting a lot of practice. You're going to be working with loops and conditionals as well. Actually, let's see, loops, conditionals, and arrays. So you're going to get the whole works in this, which is great because it's going to be just before we move into the MySQL piece. And so then you're going to be able to have code, you're going to be able to work with that code, understand at least some basics of how it operates, and then we're going to be pulling some variable information that goes into and pulls out of databases.